Actually, the Cleveland Rolling Mill Company strikes were rather widely known in the 1880s. They were reported rather often in the New York Times, both in 1882 and in 1885. For those who are interested, after I talk about it, there are some photographs that are up here of the rolling mills and iron and steel workers generally. You might be interested in looking at them. I had never seen them myself, as a matter of fact. You mentioned that I wrote an article on these strikes, which indeed I did. I'm not going to read a paper to you, thank God, I'm sure you're saying to yourselves. On the other hand, it is not all off the cuff. It's a combination of things that I have jotted down, plus some products of scissors and paste. I took out some parts of those articles that seem to have expressed pretty well what I meant, and rather than try to put it in new words, why not simply read what I had already written. I'm delighted to be part of what I think is a very important series. I'm happy to, or I don't know whether it's an advantage or a disadvantage to follow Oscar Hanlon. He was an old teacher of mine 190 years ago, it seems to me. Obviously knows a good deal about American immigration history. I might say first that I do think this is an important series, and this whole enterprise is an important one. If you think of the historical importance of the city of Cleveland in American history, and yet so little is known about it, so little has been written about it, so few of the materials have been organized and systematized, and yet a typical example of a late 19th century American industrial metropolis. Why such has been the case, I don't really know. It's equally true that the ethnic experience and the immigrant experience in Cleveland has been relatively little studied, despite some of the recent publications that, as some of you know at least, have come out of Cleveland State. This city is indeed a city of immigrants, most of them coming here to be laborers, many of them skilled, many of them unskilled. I think a couple of statistics are interesting here, and I know that statistics usually dull everybody's expressions, so there are only a couple. In 1860, there were 19,437 immigrants in Cleveland, according to the census, which of course is not necessarily gospel truth. By 1910, that figure of the foreign-born in the city had reached 196,170. That's a tenfold increase. And yet, that 19,000 roughly constituted 44.8% of the city's population in 1860. The 196,000 constituted 35% of the city's population 50 years later. Cleveland was a city that was very popular with immigrants, but what that percentage demonstrates is that it was equally popular with native-born Americans, because Cleveland offered employment of all kinds to all sorts of individuals. But I'm here to talk, of course, about immigrants, and that is what I intend to do. In heavy industry, in iron and steel, in those sorts of enterprises, immigrant labor was by far the most important component. One historian wrote, quoting a manufacturer, "There is nothing American about the manufacture of iron and steel in Cleveland except the capital and the organization. No branch of manufacturing in the city employs a higher proportion of foreign labor. In 1910, according to the federal census, 91% of the common labor employed in blast furnaces and rolling mills, and 71% of the semi-skilled labor was foreign-born. In one mill, there were only 2 Americans out of a total labor force of 600. The unskilled were increasingly, at the end of the 19th century, Southern and Eastern European immigrants, the so-called new immigrants who came to the United States and to Cleveland increasingly from the 1870s to the 1880s onward, as a whole series of changes occurred in Europe that brought to Eastern and Southern Europe all of the economic dislocations upon which immigration had been built. These unskilled Southern and Eastern Europeans did indeed frequently replace skilled workers. Their arrival made the task of forging labor unity and of forming unions more difficult than it otherwise might have been. A labor force with a diversity of languages, so that frequently individuals could not communicate with one another. The numbers involved and the continued arrival of significant numbers of unskilled laborers year after year, meaning the availability of a large pool that employers could call upon, plus the fact, and these are only some of several, that Many of the Southern and Eastern Europeans were, as immigrant historians call them, birds of passage. They intended not to be permanent residents of Cleveland, but rather temporary residents, intending to stay only long enough to earn a sufficient amount of money to take home and there to resume their old style of life. That many of them, many of your ancestors stayed, was a matter of luck or lack of luck or whatever other word one might want to use. Not only did they frequently replace skilled workers and make the task of labor unity more difficult, Southern and Eastern Europeans also frequently engaged in a significant amount of violence. The circumstances of their arrival and their employment prompted many contemporary Clevelanders, as well as historians subsequently, to explain the situation in rather simplistic terms, employing all of the new categories of eugenics and stuff that were becoming increasingly widespread at the end of the 19th century. Americans began to say that Southern and Eastern Europeans were representatives of inferior races, the dangerous blood of dangerous races, that they were simply stupid cattle, that they could not be unionized. They were not intelligent enough to know where their own self-interest lay. And therefore, to lay the onus of labor violence, of labor disunity at the end of the 19th century, to lay the onus of violence and bloodshed on the newcomers themselves as beaten men, as one man said in the early part of the 20th century, as beaten men of beaten races. Now, indeed, labor relations were difficult and were often violent, but as I've suggested, the explanation, the standard explanation, is much too simplistic. It is much more complicated than that. And some of the complexities involved I want to talk about in terms of the strikes at the Cleveland Rolling Mill Company in 1882 and 1885. A major employer on the east side of Cleveland in the Newburgh section of the city. In the early 1880s, a company that employed 5,000 people, which was a very, very large plant at that point in American history. It was a company owned by the Chisholm family of Cleveland, and it was also a company that after the turn of the century became part of the United States Steel Corporation. First, the setting or the situation, I think. In 1880, the Rolling Mill Company had a workforce that was essentially skilled, essentially of British stock. Most of the skilled workers were Welsh, Scottish, or English. And most of the labor force was Protestant and unionized. They were members of the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. Now, there were native-born Americans who were skilled workers there. There were also significant numbers of Irish Catholics, but primarily British, Protestant, skilled, and unionized. The Chisholm family, William Chisholm, the president of the firm in the early 1880s after the death of his father, Henry Chisholm, was attempting to use new technology to replace skilled, rather highly paid workers with cheaper, unskilled hands. In addition, he was switching his firm increasingly from the manufacture of iron to the manufacture of steel. Steel was a particularly mechanized process, required less skilled help and more unskilled help. It is at this point that numbers of Bohemians and Poles were beginning to arrive in Cleveland, and began, particularly the Poles, to settle in what is now and was then the St. Stanislaus neighborhood of the city. It's in 1881 that the Bishop of Cleveland decided that St. Stanislaus would be permanently located where it now is, though it is not the building that is presently there. The result of this attempt on Chisholm's part to replace skilled with unskilled hands was naturally enough rising tension. Economic tension, obviously enough, between Chisholm and labor. But more to the point here, I think, is that labor was divided not only by skill, but also by ethnicity and culture. Because the company's skilled workers were overwhelmingly British, and its new unskilled workers were Southern and Eastern Europeans, especially Poles and Bohemians, economic tensions over jobs automatically acquired ethnic overtones. Despite the fact that in the spring of 1882, the iron and steel business was in a severe recession, the skilled workers who were members of the Amalgamated decided to make certain demands on Chisholm. In May of 1882, they demanded higher wages and equally important and explosive as far as Chisholm was concerned, they demanded the recognition of their union. Chisholm refused their demands, and on the 10th of May, 1882, the skilled workers left their jobs. Chisholm then closed the plants. But his intentions in early June became very rapidly clear. His intention, simply put, was to reopen the mills with unskilled Polish and Bohemian non-union cheap labor. He recognized the fact that this would result for a considerable period of time in inefficiency, etc., but he was willing to deal with those situations as they came along. The situation as far as the skilled union hands were concerned was that they had to stop unskilled immigrant cheap labor, scabs as they were called obviously, from taking their jobs. But they had to do that without violence, because the union existed and the strike went on in a particular political environment in which, for one thing, the general Cleveland citizenry sympathized with the skilled workers. They did not particularly like Chisholm. They saw the Cleveland Rolling Mill Company as representing the emerging large impersonal American firms. Yet, though they sympathized with the workers and their needs for adequate wages, Americans and Clevelanders generally believed in the absolute right to work. So that if you went on strike and somebody took your job, that was just tough luck. If you decided to join a union, fine. If you decided to lead a strike, fine. But you had no right to either employ violence, nor did you have the right to block the entrance to a mill. If you didn't like the wages that your replacement was going to accept, okay, then you could accept the same thing and perhaps get your job back. It was also an environment in which, though sympathetic towards labor, American citizens generally believed that it was the responsibility of government to maintain the right to work. That it was the responsibility of city government in this instance to assure that the mills remained open and that those willing to work were able to take advantage of that opportunity, even if it meant taking the jobs of those who were already attending the machinery. Therefore, the skilled unionists, as I suggested here, have to prevent the unskilled from taking their jobs, but they have to do it without violence. That means cajoling, arguing with them, attempting in any nonviolent way that they could to attempt to get them to refuse to enter the mills. That was difficult. For one thing, the language barrier. For a second thing, skilled workers inherently suspicious of unskilled workers and looked down their noses at unskilled workers. And this natural economic suspicion was deepened, as I've suggested earlier, by ethnic and religious tensions. The result was that as Chisholm imported unskilled Poles and Bohemians, as skilled workers attempted to argue with those approaching the gates of the plant, the level of tension rose day by day. Workers obviously shouting at one another, rocks began to be thrown, and even housewives on opposite sides of the fence began to lock horns. Again, a little part from my article here might make this clear. Workers' spouses frequently locked horns. When Henrietta Medley, a black woman whose husband was a striker and union supporter, which is called her neighbor Mary Bujeski, whose husband was working at the mills, a black sheep, the Bohemian woman called Mrs. Medley a black nigger. Mrs. Medley then tried to choke Mrs. Bujeski, who in turn defended herself with a broomstick, creating a general scuffle. Chisholm attempted to reopen, as I've suggested here, using these new unskilled hands. Finally, there was a confrontation. A confrontation between the strikers and the police finally occurred on Tuesday, June 13th, 1882. After the factories let out at 6 p.m., 6 carloads of Bohemian and Polish workers went home by rail without incident. But when about 150 immigrant hands, surrounded by 4 city policemen, headed for the streetcars to take them to the 14th Ward, the procession was temporarily halted at a rail crossing by a train. The crowd then began to jeer. Ignoring the Union marshals, a group of women threw stones. And it's interesting when you get into labor history how often violence is started by women at the back of the mob. The men are in front. The women, wives and girlfriends, are the first ones to throw the slag. Why, I don't know. A group of women threw stones, and quickly pieces of slag, this is from a newspaper, quote, pieces of slag, stone, and cinders were flying through the air like hail, directed first at the strikebreakers, but soon at the police as well. Detective Lawrence was beaten and kicked, and Patrolman Eustace was, quote, thrown into excruciating agony by being hit with a brick in a vital part, close quote. Newspapers, here I go off on a tangent again. Newspapers were very descriptive in the 19th century. Much more descriptive, I think, than contemporary newspapers. As soon as the Bohemians and Poles, many of them bleeding, left aboard the streetcars, the police charged the mob with drawn clubs. They knocked down a number of rioters and arrested several, including what appeared to be 5 English-speaking men, 1 German, and 2 Bohemians. As far as the cause of the skilled workers and the union was concerned, that violence was an utter disaster. Public opinion turned immediately against the skilled workers. The mayor declared the city, or at least that ward rather, in a state of insurrection. He filled the region with police. He alerted the light artillery, the Cleveland Greys, and even the Gatling gun battery. Gradually, under police protection, more and more unskilled Bohemians and Poles entered the mills, and by late July, that particular strike was over. The mill now having a new workforce, and the unskilled Polish and Bohemian, and the union's charter was revoked by the national organization. The union and the skilled workers, and many others as well, blamed the failure of the strike on the Poles and the Bohemians. And yet I hope by what I've said here that it's obvious that that is too simple. The factors of technological change that permitted capital to utilize unskilled labor, the circumstance of market conditions deciding to strike in a down market, the political environment in which this kind of enterprise had to be conducted, and frankly, uncreative union leadership, which could not overcome its prejudices sufficiently to unite the workforce. The union was fighting essentially for its own interests, essentially for the interests of the skilled workers. And argue though it might to the contrary, the unskilled knew perfectly well what was up. The new workers sensed that the idea of labor solidarity really wasn't there from the union's point of view, and so they were perfectly willing to go to work. Chisholm believed, as a result of his success in 1882, that he had acquired a labor force that was cheap and pliable. Cheap, yes. Pliable, no, much to his horror. There was a recession in the late spring and summer of 1885. By July 1st, the company had reduced wages of almost everybody, skilled and unskilled, 50%. The unskilled workers decided that they would not take this any longer, walked off their jobs, and went through the mills, forcing all of the others still tending machinery to leave, forcing the company to halt operations. The unskilled men also got the skilled workers to join this close-up, though the skilled workers did so with a certain degree of reluctance. The skilled workers were a little leery, particularly of the apparent willingness of the unskilled to engage in a lot of violence. Again, from my article about an incident that occurred on July 6th and 7th. An example of this willingness on the part of the unskilled to be violent, according to an English-speaking worker who refused to participate, was the decision of the Bohemians and Poles at a meeting in the Peach Orchard, so-called, to march to the company headquarters in downtown Cleveland on Monday, July 6th. Led by a drum corps and the American flag, rather than the red banner which some favored, some 1,500 strikers paraded to the National Bank building where President Chisholm received a workers' committee but refused their demands for an immediate restoration of wages. They next called on Mayor George Gardner, whose offer to mediate the dispute mollified them, but only temporarily. On Tuesday, July 7, after a morning rally at the Peach Orchard, about 1,000 Poles and Bohemians, led by drums, banners, and according to the newspaper, a beardless young Polak in a blue suit with a fiery red handkerchief tied around his neck, marched off to close the H.P. Nail Company because the Chisholm family was a major stockholder in the enterprise. Shutting the works with little difficulty, the crowd proceeded to the Union Steel Screw Company, in which the Chisholms also had an interest. Forewarned, company officials had bolted all the doors. The mob, undaunted, broke them down and surged into the building, severely beating the company's president, Fayette Brown, who had attempted to block their entry. They forced men at work to quit and terrified a number of young women employed in the plant who, quote, with disheveled hair, streaming eyes, and blanched faces, ran hither and thither, pleading that their lives might be spared. After listening to speeches in Bohemian and Polish, the strikers returned to their homes. Again, the police were called. Again, the Gatling gun battery was alerted. Mid-July, Chisholm again tried to reopen, but once more a melee or a mob of 1,000 Poles and Bohemians, again with violence led by women, took matters into their own hands. Stones flew, and Chisholm decided that it would be a good idea to close operations until further notice. The strikers, in fact, started talking about a police riot. We think of the term police riot as being a phrase employed primarily in the 1960s and the 1970s. Not true. It's been around in American history for a long time. This confrontation, this police riot in July, did at least have one benefit as far as the strikers were concerned. It helped to forge an alliance between the skilled and the unskilled. But the leadership of this alliance was in the hands of the skilled British Protestant workers, and the organization met in the Welsh Church. There is a photograph over there of what used to be Wales Street. The question was whether the new labor organization could hold together. The answer was no. Both the skilled and the unskilled workers feared the other would suddenly break ranks and take all the jobs, and each continued to believe that the other favored poor strike tactics. As one immigrant worker phrased it in a bar room, the skilled workers, quote, say hurrah, hurrah, but do nothing. We know hurrah, we fight. Davis and Evans, who were two skilled workers, did little to allay the foreign workers' skepticism. All of the organization's meetings were held in the skilled workers' 18th Ward neighborhood, and the Crucial Relief Committee, which was to investigate all requests for assistance, was composed of English-speaking skilled workers with the exception of one Bohemian and one Pole. Consequently, most unskilled immigrants doubted the committee's impartiality. As a Pole vividly expressed it, the committee gets the money. Bricky Flanagan, a skilled, prominent Irish worker who was called that because of his red hair, gets the whiskey. There's a stereotype again. And where am I here? The committee, Bricky Flanagan, the committee gets the money, Bricky Flanagan gets the whiskey, and the Polak gets nothing. The English-speaking leaders, in turn, were convinced that the Poles and Bohemians were taking advantage of the Relief Committee. According to an unnamed member, probably George Cookson, its chairman, they, quote, take everything they can get. Some of them have saved up a little money and are able to take care of themselves, but they plead the most abject poverty and work, are you ready for another modern phrase, the charity racket for all it is worth. The situation went from bad to worse. Finally, in September of 1885, Chisholm decided to reopen the mill. The market had gotten better. He wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to make profits. And he hinted to the leaders of the strike that if they would return to work, he would soon restore the wages of late May. But he would not do so right away. The leaders of the strike were willing to do so. The Poles and Bohemians, the unskilled workers, however, refused, wanted an immediate restoration of their original wages, and again began to attack those who were going into the mills. Alarmed at the possibility of another major confrontation, the mayor told Chisholm either raise the wages and go back to work or close down. I'm not going to get involved, the mayor suggested in the midst of another similar confrontation. So Chisholm accepted the mayor's suggestion. The mill reopened, and the late May wages were restored, supposedly being a victory then for the unskilled Poles and Bohemians who had been pushing the hardest for this particular result. There was an irony, however. Alarmed by their perseverance and willingness to use violence, Chisholm refused to rehire many of the Bohemian and Polish workers. If the strikers had won the victory claimed by the National Labor Tribune, a labor newspaper, the unskilled immigrants were responsible, and yet many of them now had no jobs. Nor were erstwhile 18th Ward environmentalists entirely happy by the resumption of production. All of you environmentally minded people will appreciate this. Complained, these are pen names of somebody writing to the editor of a newspaper, complained anti-monopoly, equal rights, golden rule, and others. To the editor of the Cleveland Leader, quote, "We must submit again to the annoying smoke and acid from the mill. While the strike lasted, the half-dead trees and other vegetation improved, but our trees and gardens were destined to thrive no longer than the duration of the strike." There are lots of conclusions that one can draw from these two events, and I'm only going to detail a couple of them for you here. That the Poles and the Bohemians were not either vicious scabs on the one hand or crazy revolutionaries on the other. Poles and Bohemians, though unskilled, though unable to speak English, had goals and values. Their wariness of the amalgamated union, for example, is understandable. They lacked the skilled workers' ideology and recognized that since the union would not grant them membership, it in fact had no place for them. The unskilled immigrants' rejection of the amalgamated in favor of jobs in 1882 was not an irrational failure to grasp a golden opportunity which the union theoretically offered, but rather was a realistic response to a situation in which there were few choices. Both in 1882 and 1885, they recognized that neither the Cleveland Rolling Mill Company, city officials, the amalgamated, nor skilled workers generally offered courses of action which offered a realistic hope of achieving their goals. Most Bohemian and Polish strikers believed they were struggling to achieve, not to destroy, what they saw as basic American rights and values. Not those of democracy and rapid social mobility through education and a career, so often and so erroneously ascribed to them by American sentimentalists, and I might add historians, but the much more simple one of a steady job, a secure job at adequate wages. Significantly, they usually carried the stars and stripes in their parades and not the red flag, whose use was blown far out of proportion by reporters. Their use of the American flag was not a publicity gimmick, but an expression of their hopes, however modest, for the future, hopes which a successful strike would keep alive. Most Clevelanders, however, failed to appreciate the Bohemians and Poles' motives and values. Terrified by the violence in the streets, they preferred to place blame on an easy target, such as the newcomers in their midst. The blinders which the skilled workers and the amalgamated wore had even more serious consequences, at least in terms of their own position. They recognized the threat which the unskilled workers presented, but burdened by their own prejudices, they were unable to seek their cooperation effectively in 1882, let alone harness at any time, for the good of all workers, the Bohemians and Poles' obvious tenaciousness in pursuing their goals. The rolling mill company had modernized to take advantage of a new technology, but the skilled workers failed to grasp the fact that they too had to alter their own ideas and tactics to meet a new labor situation. A similarly biased and self-destructive attitude continued to bedevil most American union leaders, and indeed most American workers themselves, for another generation. They preferred to see an important source of labor's difficulties not within themselves, but in the supposedly inferior racial qualities of Southern and Eastern European immigrant laborers. The solution, therefore, lay in immigration restriction, a far easier task than grappling with the complex problems which technological change, prevailing political and economic attitudes, and especially ethnic cleavages produced. Creative, effective unionism would come only when labor leaders recognized that differences in nationality masked a deeper agreement about what all workers deserved, and that unskilled European immigrants could play a productive role in constructing a more equitable social and economic order.